Good afternoon, Patriots, and welcome to the 94th audio file in the audiocast series known as the Q News Patriot. I am the Q News Patriot. My name is SGAnon. Well, Patriots, just a few days on now from audio file 93, and we're seeing yet again the overarching picture that Anons and Awake Patriots have been forecasting for quite a number of years, beginning to take physical form and unveiling itself in front of our very eyes. From President Trump's TruthSocial rampage just a few days ago, clearly demonstrating to us and reminding us yet again of his involvement in the high-level Q operation under the pseudonym Q+, to Kash Patel and Dan Bongino's bald-faced lies to Maria Bartiromo in a recent interview on Fox News regarding the circumstances behind Jeffrey Epstein's death, Anons and Patriots are being actively and now publicly vindicated in their assertion that a silent world war has been ongoing in front of our very noses for more than 7 years running and continues all of the way to this present moment. For those of you out there who have followed Q News Patriot for more than a handful of months, for example, you're going to be aware that some of the changes in this broad worldwide landscape that shows like this one and others have been talking about for a while, really since before 2020, require enormous amounts of time in preparation and execution. And in many cases, Patriots, they can take years to materialize visibly for the public. We really are that far ahead of our fellow man and our fellow woman, and we've been given the eyes to see, and we shouldn't allow ourselves to be lost on that. While we've been spectacularly incorrect on this program at different points along the way, and that's something I own transparently and authentically with each of you, we've also had a lot of prognostications that have either happened directly like we thought they would, or with the same overall essence, but in a slightly different final design. And those instances serve as reminders that if we as patriots are willing to look between the lines, not in absurdity, but with an open and logical mind and a discerning heart, we can still see the individual and obvious trees that show themselves along our physical trail while maintaining our wonder at the grand majesty of the forest and of God's perfect design. Patriots, we've got a lot to unpack today. Really a great number of things that have been happening in recent days, and I think we've got a lot to look forward to as we go through the rest of 2025. We're going to start with a quick word from today's audio file sponsor, BF7 by SGAnon, and afterward, we're going to dive right into our discussion. Patriots, we could describe the post-COVID world in a lot of different ways, but on a personal note, the biggest differences for my family and I between pre-2020 and post-2020 really center around two main areas: the broad public awakening that we talk about often on this show, and the challenges to maintaining and improving personal health and vitality. I can't speak for all of you out there, but with respect to that inside our household, one of the biggest changes we've seen over the last 5 years has been a noticeable drop in vigor and energy levels. Going into COVID, for example, I was working as a full-time upper mid-level business manager between 45 and 65 hours a week, and it was nothing at all for me to come home after work every day, even on the long weeks, split the housework up, and be an involved and active dad. These days, I keep a schedule that's slightly less than 45 hours each week, with different and arguably less stress than a few years ago, and by the time I hit 9 p.m., it feels like I could fall asleep standing up. I blame that on a lot of different things, from disrupted hormones and American frankenfoods to the biologically altered reality of our world. But over the last 5 years, I've also learned that a major cause of depleted vitality is a deficiency of something called nitric oxide molecules, blood-borne molecules that help relax the body's blood vessels, veins, and arteries, ultimately resulting in better blood flow and circulation to areas of the body that often find themselves shortchanged once our main internal organ systems are provided for. Big Pharma will charge you anywhere from 9 to 20 times the standard market value for their nitric oxide boosting prescriptions, when effective supplements for blood and circulation support exist and are on the free market already. I've tried a couple of these myself over the last few years, but I recently got the chance to try Blood Flow 7, made by SGAnon, and I have to say, Patriots, I think it really works. BF7 is a triple action supplement with clinical studies behind it that show a 150 to 200% increase in nitric oxide production and a widening of vessel and arterial channels by over 50% from baseline. This translates to better flow and more oxygen and nutrition being delivered to both critical and non-critical bodily systems. I've been taking 2 capsules right after breakfast each morning, and I've noticed better stamina, better focus, and more vitality, even on the days where I skip my morning coffee. It's made with naturally derived ingredients, including the inactive fillers, and customer reviews found online suggest people are noticing real results with BF7 in just hours and days rather than weeks or months. Additionally, SGAnon offers a full 60-day empty bottle money-back guarantee on their product in the unlikely event that a customer out there isn't fully satisfied with their experience. You can try Blood Flow 7 by Juvenon for a little over $1 a day by navigating to www.bloodflow7.com/QNP or clicking the link below today's video. Once again, that is www.bloodflow7.com/QNP or look for the link in the description box below. It worked for me, and I hope it works for you too. Thanks. All right, Patriots, let's go ahead and get our discussion going today by examining some of the proofs and some of the evidence to demonstrate that the silent world war is ongoing in the background, that it's ramped up in intensity, and that it's moving in a proper direction on behalf of patriots and we the people everywhere. If we come over here to the U.S. military southcom.mil press release website, under press releases, you can find a ton of these. And many of them include things like Coast Guard interdictions, multinational exercises, things like that nature. But the real story is, of course, Patriots buried in what's beneath the headlines. So first of all, if you examine these headlines going back 6 months, back from now to December of 2024, you will find that just in that period of time alone, that does not include anything prior to December of 2024, but just in that period of time from then until now, the U.S. Coast Guard has interdicted more than $2 billion in illegal drug and narcotics trafficking in just the Caribbean basin alone, the Caribbean theater of operations. So it's worth keeping in mind that anytime you're moving drugs and anytime you're moving large amounts of substances, you're typically also moving biological and pathogenic material. You're typically moving adjacent related things like human trafficking, human smuggling, right? These are not just neatly compartmented and segmented shipments most of the time. When you look at filling a shipping container, for example, with illicit substances, however much you can get inside that single container is, of course, the name of the game. So these headlines don't discuss anything explicitly other than the narcotics and the drug trafficking, but it's worth keeping in mind that a great deal of that occurs concurrently and simultaneously in the same physical form and in the same physical space with other types of illicit black market activities that have driven the wheels and chains of misery in the entirety of the Western world and the entirety of the rest of the world by extension for a very long time. One of the other headlines, however, that I think is very, very fascinating and one that all of us should zero in on a little bit is this Centam Guardian 2025, which was a multinational exercise that was held in Guatemala. Now, just a few weeks ago, we saw reports emerging. Actually, it's only been a couple of weeks ago now, towards the early part of this month, we saw reports emerging that Guatemalan authorities with joint law enforcement partners and interagency partners were descending basically on child dungeon and child trafficking cells located domestically in that countryside. We also saw a very radical subsect of Judaism called the Lev Tahor cult highlighted out in that particular process. The children were kept under extremely disturbing conditions. Infant-sized skeletons and buried graves were discovered in the area of these investigative efforts that were happening on the ground in Guatemala. And at the same time that those law enforcement operations were being publicly acclaimed and publicly demonstrated to the world as active, as ongoing, and as part of a broad joint agency operation, we have Centam Guardian 2025, which seeks to strengthen regional security cooperation in Central America, happening between U.S. Southern Command and the Guatemalan Ministry of Defense. Security forces from Costa Rica, the Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Honduras, and the United States will participate in the exercise, building upon the success of previous iterations of the exercise since 2018. We come down here a little bit further in the press release. Cartels and transnational criminal organizations' illicit activities continue to destabilize communities, posing a threat in the region. These groups and malign state actors exert influence that threatens security, erodes democracy, and challenges sovereignty. Now, that's very interesting, Patriots. We must work together, train together, and strengthen readiness together to collectively face these threats. Exercises like Centam Guardian strengthen our partnerships and enhance our persistent efforts to combat regional threats. The exercise will focus on developing agile and responsive forces prepared to address dynamic security challenges, including transnational threats, natural disasters, and humanitarian crises. Residents of Guatemala, may observe an increased security presence, including military helicopters and aircraft used for transporting personnel and supplies. These movements may begin prior to the official start date of the exercise as equipment and personnel are positioned. So, it's worth keeping in mind, Patriots, that at the same time, we're seeing the dovetail between the civilian law enforcement landscape on the types of interagency criminality that they're interdicting, which fundamentally falls under transnational criminal RICO-style enterprises. We're seeing military forces on the ground in Guatemala, including regional actors along with the United States. And that's also going to include like battlefield intelligence sharing, right? Reconnaissance, and surveillance apparatus enhancement and all those types of things. That's also seeking to interdict cartel and transnational RICO-style criminal activity. We have on the ground right in front of us, Patriots, evidence to show that the needle is being moved forward more and more and more each and every single day. If we come over here to the European theater, beginning on May the 11th of this year and moving all of the way through to the end of June, we have Defender Europe 2025. Defender is the Army's largest annual opportunity that exercises moving personnel and equipment into theater across modes for initial and follow-on operations. These support large-scale combat operations. Led by U.S. Army Europe and Africa Command, the exercise focuses on the strategic deployment of combined U.S.-based forces of continental U.S.-based forces, employment of Army prepositioned stock and follow-on exercises demonstrating lethality and interoperability. So it's worth keeping in mind, Patriots, that Defender in 2018, 2019 was the annual exercise where we saw tremendous amounts of what were claimed to be special operations style raids happening all across Europe. And some of those raids interdicted very large very high levels, maybe is a better way to say it, of financial and philanthropic echelons out there in the world. Some of them targeted royal pulpits, some of them targeted underground pulpits. We have press releases from 2019, 2020, 2021, consistently throughout the period of Defender Europe 2020, of Defender Europe in each year annually, that show unusual underground activity. We have heightened geological activity during those periods, and these exercises are now ongoing in Europe as we speak. And so I find it very interesting. Again, I find it impossibly coincident that we have these joint interoperability exercises being undertaken across hemispheric domains in completely different areas of U.S. military command, all seeking to enhance the capability of interoperability effectiveness and to enhance the ability to respond to threats that are of a very unusual or of a very transnational sort of multi-aligned nature. If we come over here and examine a little bit more of Defender 2025's layout and the actual operations being undertaken, there's three main segments for the exercise itself, the training exercise itself. Swift response is the month of May from the 11th to the 31st. Immediate response begins on the 26th of May and goes to the 10th of June. And Saber Guardian begins on the 10th of June and goes to the 24th of June. So in swift response, we have 6,000 U.S. allied and partner forces taken from 14 countries. It looks like the training exercise is going to be 4 near simultaneous joint forcible entries or airborne jumps into Finland, Norway, Latvia, and Lithuania. A subsequent airborne jump by Sweden will be followed by high rain live fire. Field hospital and medical operations in Lithuania, including simulated blood draw and resupply to forward position medical teams using drones, demonstrating theater medical support working under chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear conditions. So again, we're seeing this CBRNE, umbrella applied to some of the preparatory activities being undertaken by the U.S. military. Clearly, we have a situation that the military has been sort of training for and anticipating for a while, where these types of interdiction skills, maybe is the best way to say it, the mitigation skills have to be applied, and they have to be properly understood. Immediate response begins just before swift response ends on the 26th of May. This will include 12,000 U.S. allied and partner forces taken from 19 countries. Army National Guard soldiers join host nations and state partner countries to conduct live fire and training in Albania, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Bulgaria, Croatia, Greece, Kosovo, Montenegro, and North Macedonia. Patriots, they just described the blood and organ harvesting corridors and trafficking pathways in and out of southeastern and far eastern, central eastern Europe. Right around where the Ukraine is, right around where Moldova is. That whole area running up to the Baltic states. That's what we just described as the main locus, the main core of those types of activities. Let me see here. Chemical attack and decontamination training will also occur during port operations, demonstrating new equipment capabilities and coordinated response efforts alongside allies and Hellenic national agencies. NATO ally and partner mechanized brigade attacks showing infantry capabilities and modernization will also be deployed and trained on this particular component of Defender Europe 2025. And then we have Saber Guardian taken from the 10th of June going to the 24th of June, 10,000 U.S. allied and partner forces from 6 countries, 2 waterway crossings trained in Romania, demonstrating allied and partner forces' ability to rapidly move troops, a fire support coordination exercise in Hungary using aerial assets to call for and deliver artillery fire on designated targets. So again, Patriots, we don't want to look, we don't want to move into the realm of absurdity here on the podcast on this particular show and begin, assigning meaning where meaning isn't necessarily taking place. But one of the things we have to keep in mind is that there are still active national emergencies declared under executive order. There are still active national emergencies found under Title 10 and Title 50 in the United States Code. There are still active invocations that have occurred that bear Donald Trump's signature, quite frankly. And so when we look at the constellation of forces that are going to be at play here and where these forces are actually doing the bulk of their training, especially the immediate response training involving Army National Guard soldiers and the entirety of that main locus of control for real illicit criminality and the movement of illicit biological agents in and out of Eastern Europe. I find it, again, impossibly coincident that we have these types of things happening at the same time that, coordinated, almost multi-front operations are happening around the rest of the world. And they're not all aimed at, the destruction of organ trafficking, for example, but all of them are aimed at mitigating and eroding and destroying the ability of the deep state control nodes, the deep state control constructs that exist still around the planet, from being able to function properly, from being able to do the things that they do, to feed the type of dark criminality that they feed, and ultimately for them to be able to continue getting away with what they've gotten away with for a very long time, right? We are eroding and taking away their ability to do this. And this is also present in other areas with the Army National Guard. We saw the Texas National Guard just a few days ago issuing a press release on Army.mil declaring their partnership with the United Arab Emirates. Let me see here. This taken from Abu Dhabi. The Texas National Guard and the UAE will be paired in the Department of Defense National Guard Bureau State Partnership Program. The Defense Department announced in a Monday news release. The SPP, which formally welcomed the UAE as a member, will bolster military modernization efforts and enhance cooperation in integrated air and missile defense, cybersecurity, disaster response, and operational planning. In other words, we are basically teaching them how to do the types of things that the United States military has itself been educating itself on doing over the last really 10 to 15 years, right? The Pentagon also announced plans to create a major defense partnership between the U.S. and the UAE. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and UAE Minister of State for Defense Affairs signed a letter of intent to establish the comprehensive U.S.-UAE major defense partnership. The letter of intent, signed May the 16th in Abu Dhabi, represents a shared commitment to develop a structured roadmap that will guide enhanced military-to-military cooperation, joint capability development, and long-term defense alignment between the two nations. So yet again, Patriots, we're seeing joint interagency partners. We're seeing joint force readiness. We're seeing joint interoperability capability being trained and established. We're seeing the framework being built out for intelligence gathering and sharing, for surveillance sharing, for information analysis and sharing, right? And we're also seeing the physical, real world sort of rubber on the road, if you will, skill sets being applied and trained in a structure for military forces around the planet that have not been privy to those tactics and those advantages in days past. And that's one of the reasons that we have so many rump state actors around the planet, right, Patriots? When we look at the destabilization and the armed conflict capabilities that exist in the intelligence community of the Western world, or in the intelligence community of the CCP, or in transnational criminal organizations, many of whom are bankrolled by the intelligence community and are cooperative and sometimes even overlaid and overmapped with military warlords and retired warlords of a military and paramilitary force. Those types of organizations and entities have possessed the ability to remove effectively to subjugate and completely neuter the ability of civilian authority in any particular locale from operating effectively. And so what that creates is it creates a bastion all around the planet with many different safe zones, many different areas of so-called immunity or so-called untouchability, where uh, we cannot allow these types of areas to continue forward into the new world, to continue forward into the present day and in the present time. And the only way to ensure permanent elimination of that is to teach every regional and local actor all around the world how to manage their own backyard, how to watch their own garden, how to provide for themselves, how to provide for their own defense, how to provide for their own resource management, how to provide for their own trade, commerce, and fair, transparent business dealings at the international level and at the domestic level, right? Much of this does have to be taught. We're not talking about culturally reshaping and nation state building. That's a completely different ideological pursuit that really yields no fruit and can only result in perpetual conflict. But what we can do, and what President Trump, I believe, did very recently, demonstrating throughout his speeches on his trips through the Middle East just earlier this month, we can prepare a new type of soil. We can give the skills, the equipment, the training necessary to prevent, overtake and to prevent insurgent operations from ever resurfacing in the future to the point where they can actually affect the local power and the lawful authority in some sort of region and usurp the will of the people. That's one of the ways that we've seen such a divide driven into the international consciousness between nation states, because we have entire population groups that blame entire other population groups for problems that are really being started by highly cross-sectional and very small subsects of each of those population groups in one another's countries under the guise of democracy, nation state building, statecraft, and things of that nature. So, now we have the National Guard involved in the UAE through this press release. We have a lot of different state partnership programs that exist across the U.S. Army National Guard with other nation state actors around the world. We've seen those highlighted many separate times, excuse me, over these last few years. And one of the things we've also seen highlighted is an expansion of domestic training exercises, right? We've seen Jade Helm going all of the way back to 2015 and 16. We saw several different special operations training exercises that occurred domestically between 2021 and 2025. Now we're seeing the Army's largest reserve training exercise ever conducted happening this year. This taken from Army.mil from the 19th of May, Mojave Falcon 2025, the Army Reserve's largest ever training exercise. We must be prepared and ready to win in large-scale combat from Los Alamitos, California, excuse me. That's the focus of the first of its kind, multifaceted Army Reserve exercise named Operation Mojave Falcon, the largest exercise ever. 9,000 reserve service members will participate in the history-making exercise, which combines combat support training, national training, global medic training, quartermaster liquid logistics training, and nationwide movement, and will take place beginning late May in multiple training locations across the United States, including Fort Hunter Liggett, Fort Irwin, Fort Bragg, Joint Base McGuire-Dix Lakehurst, Fort Barfoot, and the Port of Long Beach in California. Now, Patriots, I don't think I even need to spell it out any further than that. We're hitting major areas where we've had deep state infiltration for a long time. Fort Bragg being on there, Fort Hunter Liggett being on there. We're hitting the Port of Long Beach, which has been a known illicit pathway for a number of really problematic types of cargo coming in and out of the domestic U.S. homeland here in the United States. Let me move a little further. As the Army has since moved away from counterinsurgency, which was centered on winning hearts and minds and helping those nations U.S. military personnel served in, large large-scale operations, or LSCO, is focused on U.S. military divisions and below being involved in high-intensity conflict and goes back to the U.S. military's industrial base in order to overcome, defeat, and surpass adversaries. Mojave Falcon focuses on tough, realistic training in a combat-like environment involving real-world missions and events. So, Patriots, we're seeing yet again the Army preparing for the deep state's next maneuver. We're seeing U.S. military forces across the entirety of the world engaging in erosive and thwarting exercises against that deep state hegemony that still exists out there, that construct that is still being, handled and intersected and engaged with. But we're also seeing the Army and many other areas of the U.S. military. These are just a few articles that I'm giving each of you, but we're seeing other components of the U.S. military as well as the Army preparing for whatever counter move or whatever counter response our deep state opponents have left as we go through this period of time, right? We are now back on the other side of that live action COG exercise that occurred between 2021 and 2025. Now we have, again, lawful civilian control of the overarching government forces of the United States corporation. We're slowly exerting civilian control back into a more republic jurisdictional kind of sense. There's changeover happening in the financial world, which we're going to get into here in just a moment. And so fundamentally, our opponent cannot persist in the current status quo without giving us a response if they are capable of giving that response. And I think you're seeing the Army, as well as other components of the U.S. military and other militaries as well, preparing for the contingencies of whatever that response is likely to be. So, one of the things that I want to highlight for each of you out there, Patriots, is that many of these exercises are running forward and preparing us for large-scale events. And the reason that those large-scale events have to come, again, is because the status quo cannot be maintained, right? And we saw something that was really astonishing, but belies a little bit about what we're talking about here and really serves to give us some credence with what we're talking about. Taken from FBI Director Patel and Deputy Director Bongino's recent interview with Maria Bartiromo. Now, many of you are going to be familiar with this interview, which I believe was it was either the 19th or the 20th of this month. It occurred with Fox News on Sunday Morning Futures. And Director Patel and Deputy Director Bongino both had a lot of different questions leveled at them by Ms. Bartiromo, but one of those questions was with respect to the manner of Epstein's death. And Epstein is a very interesting figure in the entirety of the overarching war, Patriots, both on the civilian side and on the militaristic side and paramilitaristic side, because you had Epstein money and Epstein blackmail rings being run by those high-level intelligence pulpits and those high-level paramilitarized pulpits, and oftentimes those pulpits were captured and swept up in those same rings, but you also had the Epstein rings and adjacent rings to that controlling very large civilian apparatuses like academia, high impact associations, high impact journals, right? Things of that nature, scientists, various political and government actors, various celebrity and athletic actors, right? We could go on and on and on and on. So looking at what Director Patel and Deputy Director Bongino told Ms. Bartiromo just a few days ago, it very much seems to suggest that there is much more at play here, and that these high level and very intense, sort of delicate operations are continuing to move forward and are still active, right? We know, and any of us out there that have looked at the evidence from the actual the reported circumstances of the death, the official report of the death of Jeffrey Epstein, all of us know that that's basically complete hogwash. When you look at just the comparison of the human being that was rolled out on the stretcher, for example, it's not even the same person, and it's patently obvious when you sit there and you actually analyze the photograph. The other, odd and maligned circumstances surrounding the nature of the death that night, what actually occurred inside the prison, for example, the communications blackout that occurred in that, just in that very focalized and localized area. I think we have to admit that it's completely ridiculous to think that the official report is actually what happened. And yet Director Patel and Deputy Director Bongino doubled down on exactly that line of answering when pressed by Ms. Bartiromo on the nature of Epstein's death. And I find that just very, very compelling and fascinating. And I want to highlight, Patriots, for those of you out there, you could draw a couple of different conclusions on that. You can sit back and say, that Kash Patel and Dan Bongino have now sold themselves out, that they're protecting the deep state, that there's someone's on the payroll higher up than they are, and they're just doing the same old dog and pony show. But I find that a little bit unlikely if I can be so brash. And the reason I find that unlikely is because these men have built their entire professional personas and their entire culturally relatable reputations on an association for doing right and doing justice with we the people. And they did so during an intensely delicate and sensitive period of time between 2020 and 2025 and the ascension of President Trump back to power lawfully and as the duly elected president of the United States just a few months ago. So for them to be basically throwing all of that away inside of 120 days, having just gotten into the agency, just gotten full control over what's happening, and now they're beginning to examine and go through, all of the different things that have been closed or near closed or things that aren't explained or old investigations that need, better explanation because we know that they were false, such as the Epstein one, right? And there's others like that. But I think we have to keep in mind that for them to throw all of that away this soon, there would have to be a remarkable sequence of events either getting ready to happen or that has already occurred in the background. And fundamentally, I think the entirety of the American population would end up chasing them out of town on a rail if they were actually in the service of the deep state and of the Epstein control operation at this point in time. So if that is not the case, then we have to ask why the intentional falsehood. And it's not just to say that it was an intentional falsehood. It's not enough to say that, Patriots. We're going to break this down here in just a second, and I'm going to show each of you the body language and the mannerisms from both of these gentlemen because both of them knew that they were telling a falsehood. They both knew that they were telling something that was not true. And the only time that a law enforcement official, and especially such a high-ranking law enforcement official, is able to do that is if they are doing that in the service of protecting some ancillary or parallel or bigger investigation or active DOJ operation or pursuit that is currently going on that the public is not fully aware of yet. In other words, it's operational security. The only time that you can deceive the public about something like that and misrepresent something as a law enforcement official is when you are in the service of the law to a higher and larger and more expanded degree than your audience may be aware of. So give me a moment here. I'm going to pull this up and we're going to go through it together. I just find it, again, absolutely powerfully interesting and fascinating considering the topic matter at hand, the subject matter at hand, and the impact that something like the Epstein operation actually has on large-scale power pulpits, not only here in the United States, but across the entirety of the planet. Allow me just a moment. All right, I've pulled up on the screen before each of you the interview with Maria Bartiromo between FBI Director Kash Patel and Deputy Director Dan Bongino. This occurred this past Sunday on Sunday Morning Futures with Maria Bartiromo on Fox News. The interview was right around 30 minutes or so. These two individuals hit a lot of questions for the American people. They commented a whole lot on things. I've pulled up this specific segment going back to the Epstein line of questioning, and I want each of you to pay careful attention to two things: the body language from the FBI officials as they respond to this line of questioning about the manner of Epstein's death, and also the syntactic, tactical, conversational warfare that is utilized really expertly by both of these gentlemen to shut down further vertical investigation, further exploration of that particular subject matter. So we're going to go through this. I'm going to play it and let it play through all of the way through the Epstein line of questioning first. Then we're going to come back to this 28 and about 54, 55-second mark, and we're going to go through it more slowly and break down some of those mannerisms.
Coming to Congress.
You said Jeffrey Epstein committed suicide. People don't believe it.
Well, I mean, listen, they have a right to their opinion, but as someone who has worked as a public defender, as a prosecutor, who's been in that prison system, who's been in the Metropolitan Detention Center, who's been in segregated housing, you know a suicide when you see one, and that's what that was.
He killed himself. You want me to? I've seen the whole file. He killed himself.
I know it's hard work, but you promoted Stephen Jensen, the architect of the FBI's overzealous.
So now we've moved on to the next topic. That's how brief this was, Patriots. It was about a 30-second line of discussion, a line of focus out of this, 30-plus minute interview. We're going to go back now and examine a couple of the things I was just talking about with respect to how these gentlemen deflected that line of questioning, how they responded to it, and how quickly they forced the onward movement from it.
You're coming to Congress.
So here's the question coming from Ms. Bartiromo.
You said Jeffrey Epstein committed suicide. People don't believe it.
So there's the drop of the information. Here's our initial reception moment, right? This is the initial comprehension and impact moment where the communication from psyche, excuse me, to psyche is fully understood and fully absorbed. Now watch what happens.
Well, I mean,
to the left with the eye movement as we formulate the response.
listen, they have.
The eyes did not come back for a full second, so the response took at least a few sequences of thoughts, right? We all know about the speed of thought inside of our own heads. We can sort of relate that, to and with one another to some degree. So this is a pretty good amount of time when we're talking about thought form and the movement of thoughts inside of the human being.
Have a right to their opinion, but
people have a right to their opinion, and now you're going to witness FBI Director Patel use his credibility as a point of shaming the onlooker, shaming the questioner to a degree, not a rude shaming or a publicly antagonistic style shaming, but more of an intellectual shaming to discourage further inquiry.
as someone who has worked as a public defender, as a prosecutor, who's been in that prison system, who's been in the Metropolitan Detention Center, who's been in segregated housing, you know a suicide when you see one, and that's what that was.
Okay, as someone who's done all of these things, this is a suicide. You know it when you see one. That's what this was. In other words, we're not commenting on the nature of the death outside of the official narrative. We're not belying anything at all with respect to what each and every one of us patriots out there know to be the case, which is fundamentally that it was not the type of suicide event that we were told at the very least, and we've been given impossibly coincident and what we would consider statistically significant cause to believe that other things have been at play with respect to Epstein. Now, we could pontificate, until the cows come home, so to speak, with respect on what actually is going on surrounding that Epstein orbit. Anons and awake patriots out there have surmised for a long time that perhaps there are ongoing and ancillary components to these discussions. We can't corroborate that fully, but what we can say is the official narrative is complete bogus, and these individuals know it, and yet they are defending it for some particular aim. And that aim need not be, a fundamentally negative or antagonistic aim. It could be in the service, again, of a broader law enforcement effort to deliver true justice and accountability to the American people. We have, as patriots, we simply have to rely on what our discernment tells us and go with the best information that we can. You're going to see here now Deputy Director Bongino double down on what Director Patel just did, and he's going to use a conversational shutdown technique, which again is utilized to cap the particular topic and move to the next one. And that's exactly what Ms. Bartiromo does.
He killed himself.
Conclusively, right? The statement being made impactfully, definitively, conclusively. He killed himself.
Again, you want me to? I've seen the whole file.
That was the left-hand look on behalf of Mr. Bongino, identical to what just occurred a moment ago with Director Patel. So again, this is a body language tick. This is a tell-all utilized in human source intelligence gathering. This is something important to understand. There is a message being conveyed outside of the words, outside of the verbal communications.
He killed himself.
I know it's hard work, but you promoted.
So he says, I've seen the file. He killed himself. So he reiterated the official narrative not one time, but twice in that line of questioning. And so again, patriots, we have to step back and say, what is the potential reasoning for that? It could be a lot of different things. Some of those things are, in fact, in the service of the greater good of the greater law operation that's happening. We see RICO-style investigations happening just recently, a joint agency operation nabbing, I think it was about 10 or 11 individuals for narcotics trafficking, human smuggling, weapons dealing and trafficking, those types of things. And these are happening all across the United States and with our interagency partners around the world. And that is something that Director Patel has also stressed, using those exact words a number of different times, patriots. And we only have to go and look at the directory of records put forth by DHS, Homeland Security Investigations Division, put forth by the ATF, put forth by Interpol, the Australian Federal Police, the Grecian Federal Police Force, the UK's Special Pedophile Task Force, right? We've seen a lot of these different units out there in these civilian law enforcement agencies that have immense domestic power and the ability to cooperate internationally to show that that cooperation is happening, it is taking place, and we are seeing the elimination of things like human and child trafficking at scales that we have never seen before. And I want to bring up for each of you the Epstein comparison here, just for those out there, because we can confidently say, I think, that the hogwash that we just watched coming from Director Patel and Deputy Director Dan Bongino is in fact that. It's an untrue statement. It's a falsehood. It makes absolutely no sense. And the evidence to support that official narrative is inconsistent at the very, very best. So give me a moment here. I'm going to pull this screen up as well so that each of you can sort of see the Epstein comparison. This image here, taken when Jeffrey Epstein was alive, and we've broken down some of the discrepancies here. This image here is the one taken from the supposed stroller, or stretcher, excuse me, being removed from the prison. The ears and the nose are completely different. There's also differences in the hoodedness of the eye, which are not marked on this particular pictorial example. There's also differences in where the ear line, how far the ear line actually comes down and where it terminates. All right. We have a cheekbone difference here as well. This one a little bit more slanted. This one sharper and more sunken in. You could maybe explain the cheekbone difference by saying that someone had been on a jail diet for a number of weeks, lost weight, some form in their face may have changed, but none of that alters the structure of the nose or the structure of the ears. So fundamentally, Patriots, one has to ask, if we are seeking to move the needle forward in a bigger, more grand, and more expansive way, and we have to misdirect the enemy throughout this process with publicly available information so that we can continue doing that, what is actually happening on the other side of that coin, so to speak? What is the deep state truly afraid of, and what are some of the activation maneuvers that they're going to pitch out to us in response to the advances that we have on that battlefield as we continue to move the law enforcement, the jurisdictional, and the lawful civilian authority enforcement opportunities and actions forward in this day and time? Well, I think one of the main things that has always been on the table and continues to evidence itself out more and more each day is the loss of control of the narrative, and especially control of the business narrative pertaining to money, finance, and power, right? When you establish a worldwide prison of the mind, you rely upon preconceived understandings existing in those population groups. Wherever the lie is being broadcast, those preconceived understandings help to underpin it, help to fortify it, and really help to make it a self-perpetuating system. And so the monetary landscape, the monetary system worldwide has been a giant farce for at least the last 100 years, and many of us out there are already aware of a lot of that. But we're now seeing those farcical cornerstones and those farcical underpinnings dragged out into the light for the world to see, in a way that the world is also understanding what actually occurred here. Give me a moment here. I'm going to come over to a couple of different financial news headlines, because it really serves to underscore just how much is shifting around the world and why you would have the need still to misdirect, to throw off, to mislead, to deceive your opponent on the irregular warfare battlefield. So these headlines, all from the last 5 days' time. Dollars grip slips while the yen sits on a JGB time bomb. This article taken from fxstreet.com. The FX market is signaling unease. The dollar couldn't hold its footing in Asia with the dollar yen trade sliding towards 144. Traders are front running a potential FX communique from the upcoming summit, but timing couldn't be worse for Japan. The real crisis is at home. Japan's 20-year government bond auction was a disaster. The tail blew out to 1.14%, the worst since 1987, with 40-year yields hitting an all-time high. This was not just a bad print, it was a total buyer strike, and now the Bank of Japan is cornered. QT is draining liquidity. Duration is toxic. Regional banks are choking on mark-to-market losses. They can either capitulate with fresh quantitative easing and trigger a yen collapse, or they can hold the line and watch the sovereign bond curve implode from the long end inward. There are no soft landings here, just hard choices with asymmetric fallout. Back in the US, sovereign risk has not disappeared. It's just been repriced into the spread. The 10-year dollar swap spread is still hovering around 54 basis points, signaling the market is not buying the US Treasury Secretary's "don't worry about it" world tour. Wednesday's $16 billion 20-year auction is a landmine with a slow-burning fuse. Moody's may not have triggered the blowup, but the credibility fog has not cleared either. And as we've said on this blog, fiscal credibility doesn't implode, it corrodes. Coming over here to another article taken from wolfstreet.com, Japan's 30 and 40-year bonds crater, yields spike, huge mess coming home to roost. Japan, which now has substantially more inflation than the US at a 3.6% overall CPI, is watching in astonishment as its very long-term bond yields spike in a dramatic manner. The superhero is the 40-year Japanese government bond yield, which jumped 11 basis points for a spike of 100 since the beginning of April to 3.56% overall. A rising yield means a falling price. Despite the breathtaking spike, the 40-year yield is still a hair below the rate, of Japan's overall inflation, and thereby is a hair negative in real terms. And bond yielders that bought new 40-year bonds a few years ago when the yield was below 1% are getting crushed on price because a yield spike like this in a very long-term bond means that the market price of the bond is collapsing. If they don't want to take the loss selling it, they can hold it to maturity, collecting a miserable 1% or whatever in coupon interest a year over decades, and then finally getting paid the face value when the bond matures. Japan's credit rating is 3 notches worse than the blemished U.S. credit rating. Another article from AIinvest.com, Japan's bond blowup is a warning shot for U.S. markets. The Ministry of Finance's 20-year bond sale garnered a bid-to-cover ratio of just 2.5, reflecting tepid interest. The average yield surged to 2.55%, the highest since the year 2000, with a tail spread, the gap between the average and lowest prices, that was the widest since the 1980s. The market reacted swiftly, with 30-year bond yields jumping to 3.15, their highest since 1999, while 40-year bonds climbed to a record 3.61%. The sharp move reflects a growing mismatch between supply and demand. This comes at a precarious time for the Bank of Japan, which is attempting to unwind more than a decade of ultra-loose policy while maintaining stability in a bond market that it has largely dominated. The central bank owns half of all outstanding Japanese government bonds and has begun cautiously tapering those purchases, aiming to reduce bond buying from 5 trillion again in July 2024 to 3 trillion again by early 2026. Governor Kazuto Ueda has reiterated that bond purchases are no longer a policy tool, but the market's reaction is challenging that stance. So, Patriots, we have to keep in mind that what's going on in Japan and what's going on in the Asiatic bloc, sort of period with respect to the economic side of things is absolutely going to affect what's going on here in the Western world and how this economic reorientation and restructuring long term is actually going to come home to roost. It's going to affect the mechanisms of that in the United States. It will affect the mechanisms of that in all major markets worldwide where Japanese technology, robotics, automobiles, things like that are produced. And with the U.S. particularly, we have a very tight economic sort of intertwinement with the Japanese landscape, and the Japanese government bonds have been basically the underpinning for a very long time for the fake fiat debt currency system here in the United States and its successful exportation around the world, right? We look at the manipulation of currency exchange markets, for example. You can't have manipulation in those markets and not have manipulation inside the economic submarkets that exist within nation states trading those currencies. And so we have a situation again where a pillar, a cornerstone of that deep state control matrix around the world is being assailed and is now beginning to erode and collapse underneath its own weight. And it's taking with it the publicly available narrative that everything is fine, that the old system works for everyone out there, that it's free, fair, and just. Each of us know on this program that none of that is true, but for purposes of the discussion, this is what the typical understanding at the mass population level has been promulgated to be. And now that understanding is historically and really generationally eroding. And so how can we expect the deep state to respond, Patriots? How can we expect whatever opponents remain out there, or what should we expect, maybe is a better way to say, with respect to their resistance and how they can stop or prevent or somehow derail the progress that we're making under the current Trump administration in the present day and time, and really the progress that we're looking to make over the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and 100 years as we reshape the entirety of the worldwide landscape. Well, one of the things that they will absolutely do is attempt to domestically destabilize the United States of America. And on this program, we've averaged a little bit ahead of the news cycle on some of those types of things. And we've gotten them outright wrong in some instances, but we've gotten them correct in other instances. And one of the things I think is worth keeping in mind is that everything is run on predictive programming at a mass consciousness level, at a civilization level, when you're wanting to augment public perception and public awareness and establish a newfound awareness inside a large demographic or a population group. Predictive subliminal programming or neuro-linguistic predictive programming. There's a lot of different terminologies for it, and there's a lot of subcategories of the overarching practice itself, but that is the main method of delivery, the main method of mental infiltration, if you will. And so we saw in 2020 something that was absolutely very powerful and that seared itself into the generational memory of all of us here in the United States of America, with the Summer of Love redux, with the BLM riots, with the George Floyd inflammation and the ignition of this, racial and classist division here in the United States of America, becoming hostile, becoming militant. And many of us out there are also aware by this point that none of that was truly organic. It was all pre-funded, it was all coordinated, and we have seen flavors of this again so far this year, right? We've seen flavors of that domestic instability with the Tesla terrorist attacks. We've seen all of these different threats that have been made against President Trump, not just in recent days, but going all of the way back to November, December, January, moving into this current Trump presidency period. And so what are the things that we might have left to see? What is the next logical escalation, perhaps, is a better way to ask the question, when we look at the pattern, when we look at the playbook, and when we look at the game board? Well, I believe the next logical escalation is going to be, or one of the next logical escalations is going to be the reintroduction of Derek Chauvin and George Floyd and the overarching racial division lines, the racial warfare lines, into the narrative space for purposes of trying to destabilize our domestic landscape once again. And so when we come over here, we seem to have a pattern of narrative preparation that would suggest something along these lines is in the works, going back to January 6th of 2025. And so that's a symbolic 4-year delta, right? Taken from the New York Times. Minneapolis promises police overhaul in a deal with the Justice Department. With only 2 weeks left in the Biden administration, officials hurried to finalize a plan in the city where George Floyd was murdered. So they first of all, the New York Times is claiming that he was murdered. That's never actually been adjudicated out, with the exception of the trials with Mr. Chauvin. Pardon me just a moment, Anons. If we come over here to the New York Times, this article taken from January 6th, 2025, a very symbolic 4-year delta, of course. Minneapolis promises police overhaul in deal with Justice Department. With only 2 weeks left in the Biden administration, officials hurried to finalize a plan in the city where George Floyd was murdered. The Minneapolis City Council unanimously voted on Monday to overhaul its police department to address a pattern of systemic abuses as part of an agreement with the Justice Department. So fundamentally, Patriots, right here, just in our first opening paragraph or two, we have indications to show that whatever is going on with respect to Minneapolis, the Minneapolis Police Department, the City Council, these are things that are not working on behalf of we the people, because of the individuals involved making unanimous decisions on behalf of, something like enforcing or reforming police powers. And this is something that has been a focus of our deep state opponent really since these issues began in the lead up to the inflammation and the color revolution attempt of 2020. And again, this is an attempt that I foresee being reattempted throughout this process. Coming over here, from the same day, Fox9.com, Minneapolis City Council approves consent decree with the Department of Justice. The City Council voted to approve the federal consent decree with the Justice Department that will reform policing practices within the Minneapolis Police Department. In part, MPD will be implementing strategies to help further collaboration between police and community members. The department will also receive additional training on behavioral health responses. So it's very interesting, Patriots. We talk about what we're seeing with respect to this agreement that was supposedly struck, and again, I highlight for each of you that it's being struck by individuals not in the side and in the court of we the people, and we need look no further than the show trial and the ridiculous kangaroo court that Derek Chauvin was subjected to. I'm not going to sit here and take a personal, excuse me, opinion on the man himself, but I am going to say that justice under the law, blind justice and due process has to be effective for everyone, and it clearly was not in that particular trial. But what this consent decree that they actually agreed to in the Minneapolis City Council is essentially a removal of the ability of the police force to enforce the law. If you come down here on page 16 of this 174-page consent decree under subsection B, it looks like section 3, subsection B of that, requirements applicable to all uses of force. MPD shall develop and implement clear and comprehensive use of force policies that reflect the provisions of this decree and federal and Minnesota law. MPD's use of force policies shall clearly define and describe each force option and the circumstances under which use of such force is appropriate. MPD shall require that before using force, officers consider to the extent possible the person's age, size, and whether the person may be non-compliant due to physical condition, impairment, disability, behavioral health, or language barrier. So in other words, we're requiring officers in a moment, a split-second moment in time, to consider how old a person is, whether or not they might be disabled, whether or not they might have a mental disturbance, or whether or not they might not speak English, right? And so one has to ask then, well, if that's the expectation, what is the way to overcome that? Clearly, there's not a way to overcome that. In a moment where a split second means everything, you can't possibly assess all of those different factors and make an informed decision. The next line item, MPD shall require that each strike or use of a weapon be objectively reasonable, necessary, and proportional. MPD shall prohibit officers from beginning a foot pursuit solely because a person flees upon seeing an officer. So wait, if someone flees the Minneapolis Police Department, perhaps they're guilty of a crime, perhaps they're not. But if a Minneapolis police officer is finding probable cause enough to engage them in questioning and ask, what's going on here, explain this more, give me more details about something, and this person decides to flee, MPD under this consent decree with the U.S. Justice Department and the city of Minneapolis would not be allowed to pursue that individual. So if that individual just robbed a bank or just committed a felony by buying drugs out the side of out the window of a vehicle on a sidewalk, for example, or near a sidewalk, and decides to flee an officer, the officer is not allowed to immediately begin a foot pursuit. MPD shall develop and implement a foot pursuit policy requiring officers to evaluate the risks the person poses to public safety and the risks of the pursuit itself. MPD shall require that officers avoid unnecessary force during or at the conclusion of a foot pursuit, and that officers keep members of the public and other officers safe. So, folks, it makes a lot of sense then how we saw as soon as President Trump and Attorney General Bondi got into office that this particular consent decree, at least on the part of the Justice Department, is essentially being walked back. They're attempting to get out of the decree. They're attempting to have it declared null and void and no longer effective. And ironically, or perhaps unironically, depending on how you want to cut it, the city of Minneapolis is fighting exactly that. They don't want it walked back. They like this decree. They like hamstringing their police officers from being able to effectively enforce the law. And this is just another indication to show that Minneapolis and Minnesota in general, their role in the broader narrative here at a national level is simply not done, because these events occurred in Minneapolis to begin with. The ignition point that was the BLM George Floyd Summer of Love Redux in 2020, it was epicentered primarily at Minneapolis. It had a lot of other places around the country that it affected. But on January the 23rd of 2025, let me see here, the federal consent decree approved by the city council on January 6th. Let me see here. Just 2 weeks after these sweeping police reforms were agreed upon by the city of Minneapolis and the DOJ, it appears that the agreement could get tossed out. The Justice Department has moved, has moved to pause the Civil Rights Division from engaging in any new investigations or litigation, and it also said agreements with police departments approved by the Biden administration within the last 90 days would be reconsidered. Fasting forward to February the 20th, 2025, judge approves DOJ's request to pause Minneapolis police-related consent decree. A federal judge approved the request made by the Justice Department to pause proceedings in the consent decree agreement with the city of Minneapolis that would implement sweeping police reforms. And then another month later, on March the 20th, judge grants DOJ request to further delay Minneapolis consent decree. Justice Department attorneys on Tuesday won a second 30-day stay on the pending consent decree case between Minneapolis and the federal government. Coming over here to April the 21st, 2025, so another month after that. Minneapolis consent decree with DOJ delayed for the third time this year. And now give me a moment here, Patriots. I'm having to reload this page because we lost our connection on it. Bear with me here. All right. A pending consent decree between Minneapolis and the federal government was granted a 30-day stay on Monday for the third time this year. On March 18, attorneys for the DOJ filed a motion asking U.S. Judge Paul Magnuson to extend the court's stay for another month. For the second time, that motion was granted and stayed until April 19th. On April the 18th, attorneys for the city filed a motion in opposition of the stay, saying, "This is the third time the United States has asked this court to delay, and it does so with no more explanation than its new assistant attorney general should be allowed sufficient time to review." Monday's court filing from U.S. Judge Magnuson granted a stay for another 30 days until May the 21st, stating that the public interest lies with granting the motion. So in this operative period of time, we also have headlines, Patriots, coming out from news outlets to suggest that Derek Chauvin's part in this entire discussion is also going to circle back to the broad national narrative. This taken from April the 23rd, 2025, in the midst of those stay proceedings going back to January. Derek Chauvin update, prison stabbing appeals, sentence length, and where he is now. Derek Chauvin, convicted of murder with George Floyd, was stabbed in prison and now serving his sentence in a different facility. All of us, of course, remember that. Let's go here. Following the stabbing incident, Chauvin was transferred to the Federal Correctional Institution in Big Spring, Texas, a low-security federal prison. So, Patriots, he is physically located under federal authority right now. That is so important to keep in mind. Chauvin is serving a 22.5-year state sentence for murder and a 21-year federal sentence for violating George Floyd's civil rights. The sentences are being served concurrently, meaning they overlap. With credit for time served and standard reductions, his projected release date would be 2037. Chauvin has pursued multiple appeals. In November of 2023, the Supreme Court declined to hear his appeal, effectively upholding his state conviction. He is currently seeking to overturn his federal conviction, arguing ineffective assistance of counsel and requesting to examine preserved tissue samples from George Floyd's autopsy. Legal experts generally consider Chauvin's remaining legal avenues limited, and the likelihood of overturning the conviction is viewed as slim. But if we come over here to Marjorie Taylor Greene's X account, posted on May the 14th, so just a couple of weeks after that article, about 3 weeks after that article, Minneapolis and state leaders prepare for possible Derek Chauvin pardon. And Marjorie Taylor Greene says in the caption, while she shared this picture, "I strongly support Derek Chauvin being pardoned and released from prison. George Floyd died of a drug overdose." The very next day, the SC Times ran a story, "Can Trump pardon Derek Chauvin?" Governor Tim Walz reportedly said Minneapolis should prepare. Coming down here, the White House declined to comment on the potential clemency request for this story. The DOJ did not immediately respond to a question about whether Chauvin has applied for clemency. So we have mute silence coming from the Trump government on this issue right now. However, as of the 19th of March, Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt said a pardon is not something Trump was considering at the time. The Patriots, that's 2 months ago, right? And we know in an event-driven war, things are different by the hour, by the day, and by the week. Governor Walz also said he has not received an indication about a potential pardon, according to the Minnesota Star Tribune. However, he also said the state is considering the possibility. If Donald Trump exercises his constitutional right to do so, whether I agree, and I strongly disagree with him, but if he issues that pardon, we will simply transfer Derek Chauvin to serve out his 22.5 years in prison in Minnesota. So this is Governor Walz saying, essentially, we're going to come after Mr. Chauvin, who's currently in federal custody. who is currently in a federal prison if President Trump decides to release him from federal prison as a result of some clemency situation or some pardon application that might be pursued in this process. To make it a little bit more clear, though, coming down here further in this article from SC Times, to be clear, we have no credible intelligence about any pardon or planned disruptions here in Minneapolis. Since 2020, we've overhauled our emergency management and out of an abundance of caution are planning for any eventuality. That coming from Minneapolis Community Safety Commissioner Todrick Barnett. The Patriots, I understand that's a lot of information to take in and distill. We've covered a lot of different subjects, a lot of different topics today. And I also understand that many of you out there have been wondering in recent weeks just how much longer you can last in this great culture war, especially now that President Trump is again back in office. You know, like all of you, I'm waiting with childlike bated breath for the economic renaissance that President Trump has talked about many times. And like all of you, I'm often finding myself wondering how long the price of my regular 87 octane gasoline is going to be over $2.80 per gallon. But if we step back and appreciate that the enemies of humanity, of our very progeny, crafted the current systems of control and suffering over more than 100 years of linear time and in more than 200 different nations around our shared world, and this just in the modern iteration, it seems pretty reasonable to say that it's going to take a little longer than just 7 years to undo that damage and usher in the solution. And after we include the very real consideration that the war itself is not over and that there's still an opponent to be defeated and victories yet to be publicly won, it adds a sweetness to each success that we notch in our belts along this journey. We are living through the greatest period of triumph humanity will ever know, and the stories of these times will be told and retold as shining examples of the service and sacrifices ordinary human beings like each and every one of you were willing to make in order to provide for the common benefit of all, to defeat evil, and secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and for our posterity. And in doing so, Patriots, we will save and rebuild our world together. I hope you will remember this as you go through your day or your night, wherever you're at and whatever you may be up to. We are all exactly where we are supposed to be. This is SGAnon. I'll be back with each and every one of you again soon on the Q News Patriot Rumble. God bless everyone. Stay safe today. Thanks. Bye-bye.